Dear colleagues, once again, thank you so much for helping us to organize this webinar, and thank you for joining us today from Malaysia. We are welcoming you in Russia, and the Russian participants
в России.
The opportunities are open for them. Please let me introduce Shahrin Madraos, who will give his speech about the business opportunities and the overall economy landscape of Malaysia.
Okay, so I think listening to Mr. Nikita presentation, I think is quite extensive, and you know a lot of what I'm going to say here will complement a lot what he has already said. But there are certain areas that I feel I could elaborate a bit more, especially in the oil and gas and energy sector. But overall, I think there's a lot of things that we will complement each other as you listen to my talk. So, like I said earlier, my focus
дублироваться возможно. Мой фокус на
agency that make it happen, as well as to demonstrate why I feel that Malaysia is the best place for trade and investment. Covering all of this, then I will look at how Malaysia fits into the ASEAN area, or you know, and why Malaysia would be your best avenue if you were to look at growing into Asia. Yeah. So, like I said, to understand Malaysia, you got to understand the geographical location and the historical context of how Malaysia grew. You've seen this earlier that Mr. Nikita showed that Malaysia is basically consisting of 13 states. In all of these states, the reason why this is important is when you do business in Malaysia, there are certain aspects of the business that are dictated by the states, and there are certain aspects of the business that are dictated by the federal. So there are federal law and state.
что многие аспекты диктуются федеральными законами.
When you look at the 13 states plus 3 federal states, the distribution of industry across the states can be quite varied as well. And I think to some extent you also see this in earlier slide from Mr. Nikita.
Я думаю, уже знакомы с этой информацией со слайдов господина Никиты.
And the distribution, Malaysia is a multiracial and a multicultural society. So we have 3 main races in Malaysia, which is the Malay, the Chinese, and the Indian. They form the backbone of Malaysia, and because of this multiracial and multicultural, there's a lot of strength in doing business in Malaysia, because the resources that you have are easily adaptable to the global industry that try to link between India and China, as well as serving global needs. So that strength with a high degree of mature talents and multicultural and multiracial aspects of the country made Malaysia a very easy place to do business, a friendly place that understands cultural differences, very tolerable to all kinds of culture and values. So it's an easy place to do business. Now, I have to talk a bit about the early stages to understand where Malaysia is now. Malaysia got its independence in 1957, and in those early days, our economy was very much dependent on mineral and agriculture. But Malaysia understood at the very early stage that we need to industrialize. So we grew very, very fast. In fact, if you know about Malaysian history, we were among the Asian tigers in terms of economic development. We were in the same group as Korea and Taiwan that grew very, very fast in terms of industrialization. So if you look at this particular slide, you know, in the early days, our manufacturing, these are in the early 60s, 50s to the 60s, our manufacturing was almost zero, and bulk of our economy comes from minerals and agriculture. But as times progress, we move away from agriculture and we industrialize very, very quickly. Our early economy was dependent on tin. We are a very rich, tin-rich nation. That was the early days. And the early agriculture was very much depending on rubber. But then we diversified from rubber. We also grew palm oil. So rubber and palm oil becomes the balancing agricultural contribution. And the other bigger contribution to the Malaysian economy is basically oil. We basically produce oil since 1911. In the early days, that was before independence in 1957. Most of the oil development were done via concession until Petronas was created in 1974, before the federal government took charge and took ownership of oil. And that becomes, national owned resources. So you can see the diversification of our economy from mineral and agriculture, and we had a lot of emphasis on industry development from the 1960s onwards. So where we are now, if you look at Malaysian economy, our GDP is now around 400 billion US dollar. In 1960, our GDP is about 2 billion US dollars. That's a phenomenal growth from 2 billion US dollar in the 1960s to where we are now, around 400 billion US dollar. And if you look at the GDP contribution, we have moved away from agriculture. Remember, I said earlier, our early days were 100% agriculture and mining. Where we are now, you can look at, we are 82% manufacturing. And from that, you can see the industry contributes 36% to the economy, and agriculture contributes only about 7%. So we have literally moved the economy from agriculture and mining towards an industrialized economy. That is where Malaysia is now. Now, to understand what has happened, from the very beginning, Malaysia has been a very, very pro-business government. So the government from early days, because we understood that we could not depend on agriculture and mining, so we spent a lot of our resources on developing our talent, our human capital, so that it can then be a resource for industry to grow. And in the early days, industrialization happened by Malaysian government setting up MIDA, Malaysia Industry Development Authority. In the early days, MIDA was formed in the early 1960s. That's how early MIDA was, among the earliest agency that was in charge of industrializing Malaysia. But since then, you can look at in this diagram, there are 100 more agencies that has been created. I'm not going to go through every single agency. Suffice to say that because we are very aggressive in industrialization, and because we as a country are very pro-business, there are many, many agencies that was created to help business to be set up. We have a lot of policy that support businesses in terms of finance, in terms of registration, in terms of technology development, technology acquisition, collaboration, linking between industry with the universities to acquire talents, and also to link all the businesses in Malaysia into the global business infrastructure. What is important, if you look at this diagram, is although there are many, many agencies, the two main agencies, if you are looking and if you have interest to work with Malaysia, the two agencies that you should remember is basically MIDA and MATRADE. The main difference is MIDA is in charge of investment into Malaysia, whereas MATRADE is about external trade, Malaysian trading with global countries. Yeah, so both of these agencies are representative of the Malaysian government in order to help industry to invest, as well as helping industry that is in Malaysia to trade globally. So these are the two arms that are quite active in terms of promoting businesses and investment into and outside of Malaysia. Now, obviously, all the other agencies themselves do by themselves link to the global place, but their extensiveness are not the same as MIDA and Madrid. You'll see earlier, MIDA and Madrid has a lot of offices globally. And the industry themselves go globally by themselves, but many of them will go through the government agency in order to assist them in growing their businesses, as well as to help them export their product. So this collaboration between government ministries, and the industries are very dynamic in Malaysia. And you would have seen earlier in Mr. Nikita's slide as well that our Ministry of International Trade and Industry, short for MITI, has a very regular weekly, monthly session with the industry to gauge and get feedback between the industry, the business councils, the Chamber of Commerce, the association, industry themselves, to get feedback. And there's a lot of cooperation between government and industry in terms of helping the industry to grow in Malaysia. Now, specifically on MIDA, MIDA has 23 offices. MIDA, since in the beginning, in 1960, it's called Malaysia Industry Development Authority. But a few years ago, they has changed their name or rebranded themselves to Malaysia Investment Development Authority. So in the early days, Malaysia was concerned about industrialization, but now it's more, MIDA is more focused on investment into Malaysia. So you can see here, MIDA has 23 overseas center offices all over the world. So these offices basically help a potential investor that wants to invest into Malaysia to talk to MIDA to understand what kind of incentives Malaysia government provides, what kind of assistance they can provide, and what are the benefits of working with Malaysia with regards to investment within Malaysia, into ASEAN, as well as into Asia. Now, the headquarters of MIDA in Kuala Lumpur is also a one-stop center. So if you are in Kuala Lumpur, for example, you can register all your business needs within a single place, whether you're looking at the immigration, the customs, for labor, for telecommunication, for energy. So MIDA provides a very friendly and easy one-stop center for investor into Malaysia. Now, the other agency that you should remember is Madrid. Madrid, in fact, has more offices. They have 47 offices worldwide, including one in Moscow. So you can see item number 15 is Madrid has an office in Moscow. So if you are interested to either invest or to trade with Malaysia, you can be in touch with Madrid officers in Moscow to find out more information about doing business in Malaysia. Now, I've listed some of the other main agency here, and you can see MIDA and Madrid at the top. MPRC is Malaysia Petroleum Resources Corporation. I showed earlier that, you know, oil and gas is one of the backbone to the Malaysian economy. So apart from Petronas, there is an agency called Malaysia Petroleum that also help industry to invest and to work with Malaysian companies. InvestKL is like MIDA, but they help company to invest within Kuala Lumpur. The idea is most major country has an iconic city, and therefore for Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur is the iconic city where they try to bring the Fortune 500 companies to invest in Kuala Lumpur, and that is the task of InvestKL. but their role is a bit like MIDA. Malaysia, MDEC is Malaysia Digital Economy Corporation. The progression of the economy from an agricultural, mineral to industrialization, now the future is in digitalization, digital economy. That's why Malaysia, back in around 2000, we created the Multimedia Super Corridor, and we created MDEC, Multimedia Malaysian Digital Economy Corporation, to spearhead the economy towards the new industry. If you look at Nikita's talk, all this digitalization are now under the banner of Industry 4.0. So it's really a new agency that was created to help Malaysian industry at large, the economy, to move along and to help industry to invest in the right sector. Magic is Global Innovative Center. Iskandar is somewhere south near Singapore, and Labuan is another offshore investment center in Malaysia. Now, that's a bit of background on Malaysia economy. The main thing I want to talk about is Malaysian trade and the industry sector that is currently, if you like, the growth area that in Malaysia. And I think Mr. Nikita talked quite a bit in terms of all those sectors. But I have a lot other sectors here that complement that as well. Now, if you look at Malaysian economy, we are a trading nation. Our total trade is bigger than our GDP. So when you look at Malaysia, our economy is very much influenced with international trade. And if you look at here, when we talk about trade, it's about product and services. And in the product side, our total trade goes around 400 billion a year, 400 to 500 billion US dollar a year. And that's we always have a trade surplus. For products, the biggest trade component in Malaysia is electrical and electronics. You can see here 36.7% of our economy, of our trade, comes from electronics. Next is petroleum and chemical, petrochemical. Then you have palm oil and you have machineries. Now LNG comes under petroleum products. So you can see that the biggest component is actually E&E, petroleum, palm oil, machineries. And then you will see a lot of high-tech industry, optical, scientific, medical equipments. So there's a lot of emphasis on high-tech, high technology sector in Malaysia. In the services sector, on the other hand, Malaysia always have a trade deficit. Unlike in product, we always have a trade surplus. In the services, we always have a trade deficit. And the biggest component in our services is basically tourism and travel and transport. So you can see that these two, logistic and transport, plus the tourism is the biggest component, plus the business services. Those are the biggest component in Malaysian trade. Now, when you look at how Malaysia trade globally, you can see also the pattern depending on which region we trade. Our biggest, our main trading partner is basically ASEAN. So you can see ASEAN is a big trading partner. Europe and America, those are the big trading partner. And in these sectors, in this region, you can see electrical electronics is the bigger component, is the biggest component in our trade. But in West Asia, Africa, you can see palm oil is the bigger component because we trade more on electrical electronics. Countries, for example, electrical electronics, China, Japan, America, Europe, where a lot of electrical products are being developed. So that's where you'll see the distribution. The top 5 countries that do trade with Malaysia is basically China, Singapore being more of a transit trading partner, because a lot of the export goes via Singapore to a lot of other countries. But the final product always ends up in China, USA, Japan. These are the area, and you can see why in these countries, mainly because of the electrical and electronics industries are concentrated in these countries. Now, with Russia, I purposely put this as well in here to give you a feel on our trade with Russia. Again, with Russia, the biggest component of our trade is actually electrical electronics, rubber, machinery, and processed food, and a bit of palm oil over here. So again, a bulk of our trade with Russia actually in manufactured goods, and very little on agriculture and mining. So again, it reflects, the kind of relationship that Malaysia has with countries that we trade. The growth with each of these countries, you can see on the graph here, it has been quite slow growth. So definitely there's a huge potential in terms of looking at growing trade between both countries. Now let's look at the investment opportunities. In what I want to do is to focus on three main area of economy. The first one is the biggest component of our trade, which is electrical and electronics. Naturally, you can see the historical context of how this has developed. From the very beginning in 1960s, we were very big in terms of promoting investment in electrical electronics industries. That's how we industrialize. The things like, air condition, machineries, those were the early days. But as we progressed, we developed ICT, multimedia. We were going very much into programming, into multimedia, into computer software development. And the last few years, you've seen a lot more e-commerce, logistics, logistic hubs for e-commerce transactions. So that there's a natural progression, and each of these are quite interrelated and quite connected in terms of the verticals for item number one. The second part that you can see as well in our trade, the petroleum and oil and gas, because we are a major producer in oil. So in ASEAN, we are behind Indonesia in terms of total crude oil production in a given year. We produce about 700,000 barrels of oil a day. If you include condensate and gases, it goes around to 1.2, 1.4 million barrels. So we are a natural producer of oil and gas. And that has been happening for the last 50, 60 years. And of late, we have been growing a lot more with refinery and petrochemicals. So we're putting a lot more value in terms of the natural resource that we we are producing. And the future is really going towards renewables, decarbonization, solar panels, energy source. So you can see again the progression of interest in Malaysia, moving along with time. Now, the third horizontal that I want to talk about is halal industry. For those who are not aware of halal industry is basically about the Muslim or the Islamic way of life. Remember, I mentioned at the very beginning, the composition of Malaysia is 63% Muslim. And Malaysia is a very strong advocate of among Muslim nations. There are about 2 billion Muslims in the world with about 3 trillion GDP value. And Malaysia is very big in terms of producing halal or Muslim certified goods, products. And halal industry is not just about food. It's about food, financial, pharmaceuticals, educational, the entire way of life, the Muslim way of life. And Malaysia is very big. In fact, halal certification from Malaysia is the most recognized throughout the world. And because of that, we became a center for a lot of things halal in the world. And along that line as well, education is big. Like I said, from the very beginning, from our independence, we have been investing a lot on education. Between India and China, ASEAN is a growth center, and you will see that Malaysia is positioned uniquely between the region, and because of our historical development, Malaysia is an English-speaking country, and because of that, our neighbors send a lot of their talents to Malaysia to study English and on further education. So education sector is also a growing sector in Malaysia. Finally, I'm going to touch just a bit on tourism to show that Malaysia promotes itself as Malaysia truly Asia. I'm emphasized again from the very beginning that Malaysia is a multiracial, multicultural society, and we really use that to our advantage in terms of helping businesses to grow from Malaysia. Now, I'm going to go in each of this category: electrical electronics, ICT, and e-commerce. Mr. Nikita has actually elaborated quite extensively in all this area. Now, electrical electronics, Mr. Nikita also showed the corridor, the northern corridor, the eastern corridor, and the southern corridor. Electrical electronics is very much focused on the northern corridor in the area of Penang, Perak, Kedah. This area, you will see a lot of electrical electronic sectors, as well as within Selangor, which is near the capital, and a little bit in Johor. That is where you will find most of the electrical and electronics industry within Malaysia. The Peninsular Malaysia West Coast is the area where you can see a lot of this high-tech electrical electronic sector, something for you to be mindful about. Now, in the electrical electronics itself, out of that 37%, the bigger portion of it is in semiconductor. So Malaysia is very big on semiconductor, integrated circuit, transistors in those sectors. So in Penang, we have companies like Intel, AMD, and all those big giants that has their wafer and electronic industry in that sector. In fact, the electronic industry value chain is quite well developed in Malaysia. We have the R&D, the design, the manufacturing, the assembly, packaging, and you can see some of the major names in here that are already in Malaysia. So you know, I have been to a couple of investment abroad where people are quite surprised when they first thought of investing in Malaysia. They find out that they could find a lot of supporting industry in Malaysia that already existed, and that is partly because, remember, the agencies that we have developed. I said that we have a very mature government agency, and these agencies are within all this value chain. They assist them in R&D, they assist them in manufacturing, they assist them in finding markets and so on. So, you know, Malaysia is a very business-friendly country. Then you can see other parts of the E&E in this value chain. Yeah, so there are the automatic data processing machines, the parts and accessories, electrical machineries, electrical apparatus, and so on. So these are the bigger components of the E&E within the Malaysian E&E value chain. Now, apart from E&E, I mentioned that we move into ICT, the software component. Mr. Nikita also show we have the MSc, the Cyberjaya, Cyberview. We have location that specialize just on software development, and MDEC, Malaysia Digital Economy, is the agency that helps a lot of this software digital economy component. The assistance is not just about bringing foreign investment into Malaysia, but also to help the ICT industry to provide their services to all the other companies, industry in Malaysia. And that's where Industry 4.0 comes in, because Malaysia believes that for us to be competitive with the likes of all our neighbors, remember, Malaysia has only 32 million population. Indonesia is about 300 million. Our neighbors are, 5 to 10 times bigger than us in terms of population. So we cannot compete in terms of cost of labor. So the competitive edge that Malaysia promote is more on utilizing technology, efficiency, quality of talent, ease of doing business, really be more progressive and looking at the higher value, high technology sectors. And that is where the focus of Malaysia is. And you can see in MDEC initiative, they are not only looking at startups, but they are also looking at scaling up companies. So this is where they really apply technology to help industry to grow. Now, the third component I mentioned is the e-commerce. Digitalization and global economy, because Malaysia is such a small nation, we aspire to become the center for doing e-commerce. A few years back, we started what we call the Digital Free Trade Zone, the only first free trade zone outside of China. Malaysia worked with Alibaba to have a digital free trade zone whereby all e-commerce trade could go easily into Malaysia, process very quickly, and become a logistic hub to supply and support all e-commerce activities in the region. So Malaysia has a very high, if you look at the diagram here, very high internet penetration. It's very big in terms of growth on online consumer. And I think with the current pandemic, Mr. Nikita showed all the platforms like Lazada, Shopee, all of the platforms are quite matured in Malaysia, and it has been, the growth of this e-commerce, I cannot overemphasize the importance to Malaysia. Now, the second part I want to talk about is the energy, oil and gas and energy sector. And to understand this, we have almost 400 platforms. All the oil and gas fields in Malaysia are offshore. We do not have onshore oil and gas. All our oil fields are in the water. Water depths around 150 meter water depth, what we call the shallow water area, 150 to 200 meter water depth. That is mostly in the Peninsular Malaysia, Peninsular Malaysia, east coast of Peninsular Malaysia. In Sabah and Sarawak, that's where you're going to see the deep waters. These are the deep water, about 500 to 800 meter water depth in Sabah and Sarawak. Most of the shallow water are well developed. In fact, they've moved into brownfield. They're more matured. The future is very much into the deeper waters development. In the shallow waters, in the brownfield, most of the development are in marginal field as well as enhanced oil recovery. And you will see this, we have about 4,000 companies in Malaysia that service the entire value chain of the oil and gas industry, from upstream, exploration, development, fabrication, installation, all the way to operation. And now the decommissioning component is growing because now we have a lot of older platform that needs to be decommissioned. So again, oil and gas is moving along and moving forward because of CO2 environmental concern of carbon, CO2. There's a lot of technology emphasis on decarbonization and moving the energy sector towards renewables. So Malaysia is balancing between petroleum, oil, and renewables. That's where the future is moving. I'm going to show briefly in terms of where the areas are. Again, in the northern corridor, you can see some shipbuilding. We have a lot of refinery in the east, in the west coast of Peninsular Malaysia. Down south, this is where we have fabrication. These are in the upstream sector, yeah. And then the east coast of Peninsular Malaysia, this is where all the operations are. In Sabah, Sarawak, same thing, but here is more focused on deep water development. We have a refinery, we have fabrication, and we have petrochemical as well in this area. Now, what is interesting is upstream is very, very developed, but creating value from our crude oil is only picking up. So this is where the onshore refinery and petrochemical is the area that is growing very fast in Malaysia. And here, much of the work down south near Iskandar area, because it is close to Singapore. And as you know, we are complementing Singapore because Singapore has a limited land area. So much of the storage are being moved to Malaysia. So you see a lot of storage area here. And together with the storage area, there's a lot of refinery and petrochemical works developed. And the whole notion is Malaysia could be like the Amsterdam of Europe, where we become the distribution center for petroleum and petroleum goods into ASEAN. This is where the direction is. We are moving away, balancing is a better word, from traditional oil and gas into renewable. This is where the direction is heading. Yeah, so that's a brief thought. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the halal industry, education sector, and tourism. Like I mentioned earlier, there are about 1.92 billion Muslim in the world and about 2 trillion trade in halal industry. And MIHAS, Malaysia International Halal Showcase, is the biggest exhibition of halal in the world. Every year we do this, and more than 60 countries participated, more than 60,000 people attended. But now with the current pandemic, the physical component has shrunk, and what Malaysia is doing a hybrid exhibition. So there is a virtual exhibition plus the physical exhibition in a rather smaller scale. And this is where you can understand that Malaysia, we are quite aggressive in terms of digitalization, and we are quite aggressive on high tech and high technology because it complements a lot of things that is within our economy. To give you a perspective, there are about 1.2 million companies in Malaysia, and about 98% of that 1.2 million are SME, small medium enterprises and small medium industries. And many of the small medium industries, they are into food, fast consumer goods. And what Malaysia is doing is providing a platform like Lazada, Shopee, all the e-commerce platform to enable as many of our traditional brick and mortar industry to go into digital space. And that's why digitalization is very big. That's why Malaysia digital economy is very, very important agency in Malaysia. And you can see that even taking the lead in the halal sector, where we lead in terms of the halal food, but we are not stopping just at food. As you can see here, there's also about fashion, media creation, pharmaceutical, cosmetics, and also Islamic finance. Malaysia is a leader in Islamic finance. So, you know, we literally provide all kinds of expertise to many Muslim countries. Now, the next thing is about human capital. As I mentioned, from the early beginning in 1957 of independence, Malaysia has invested tremendously in terms of human capital development. And you can see this growth happening. And from Malaysian perspective, we are not looking at just local universities, but Malaysia becomes a center for international universities to base in Malaysia to provide the demand for human capital development in the region. And you can see down south in Iskandar, being close to Singapore, we have universities like Southampton, Newcastle, Reading, many foreign universities that has set up in Iskandar, where they shared facilities and as a base for training program between the universities and the local universities in Malaysia. So it's also a pool because many students from China, for example, that wanted to study English, they will come to Malaysia. In fact, China has set up, Xiamen University from China has set up their branch in Malaysia because, again, the strength that Malaysia has, being a multiracial and multicultural society, it's easy to find people that can speak multiple languages within the country. Now, the last part that I want to talk about is the tourism sector. We have about 2 million tourists every year. It's always a growing sector. Malaysia promotes itself as Malaysia truly Asia. It has historically been a place where trade happens. So the East and the West used to trade for spices in the port of Malacca, in the Straits of Malacca, and Peninsular Malaysia has always been the base for all kinds of people to trade. So tourism and trade is kind of a blend for Malaysia. People come to Malaysia not just for business, but also for tourism. We had beautiful islands. Redang Island is the top 5 island for scuba diving in the world. Mount Kinabalu is the tallest mountain in ASEAN. So there's a lot of multiple places. We have our national park is the oldest tropical national park in the world, older than the Amazon. Again, a lot of places to look through. Now, the final part, like I promised, is to look at Malaysia into Asia, because we said that Malaysia, our GDP is only about 400 billion, but the strength of Malaysia is being in the center of ASEAN. And if you understand ASEAN, it is, if you look at in terms of the global economy, in terms of size, ASEAN, is somewhere in the middle. But in terms of growth, between China and India, the next biggest growth is ASEAN. Yeah, and that's where you find countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia. We have a very high single-digit growth year on year for the last 10, 20 years. So the world economic growth are really pushed by the developing economy, and most of them are in this region. Now, that tells you a lot of opportunity. A growing population that requires infrastructure, logistics, talents, energy, technology, and so forth. So the demand is very high in this region, and Malaysia sits right in the middle of it. And being a center that is, 6 hours, 3 hours away from almost everyone in ASEAN, we are easily accessible. Another sector that I did not mention is aerospace. We are just behind Singapore in terms of aerospace, but in terms of repair and overhaul, the MRO services, we were just prior to the pandemic were already becoming the largest. And you can understand why, because in the ASEAN region, many of the countries are either islands or separated by water. And the means of communication is either by ship or by air. And because of that, the demand for air travel before the pandemic was very, very big. And hopefully, once we have this vaccine sorted out and business travels can happen again, what will happen is you will see a lot of growth in air traveling and aerospace industry in this region as well. And that is why AirAsia is the largest ship traveling air industry are based in Malaysia. So, they provide traveling across ASEAN in a very affordable manner. If you look at in terms of economy, Malaysia is really in the same league as you can see here. Thailand, Singapore, and Malaysia. Indonesia is the biggest in ASEAN in terms of GDP. But when you look at GDP per capita, because our per capita, our population is only 32 million, we have one of the higher GDP per capita in the region, just behind Singapore and Brunei. Yeah, so again, it goes to show that Malaysia expect to become a high-income nation in the next 5 years. So we are currently moving towards a high-income nation, and it's worth to remember that as we move towards high-income nation, we are, in terms of cost of doing business, is at least a third of what it is in Singapore, but you get the same kind of talents and resources quality as to our southern neighbor. But because we do not have the size in terms of cheap labor, so as a country, Malaysia has to move up into the high value, high technology industry, and not compete in the low value industry segment. Now, in terms of ranking, you can see that in terms of digital legal framework, we are top 5 in the world. In terms of global security, cyber security, we are second in the world, and so on and so forth. So you can see in terms of ranking, Malaysia actually is a very safe, a very friendly, a very easy place to do business and to look at investment. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the market in the region within ASEAN, digital economy alone is about 300 billion. There are about 400 million digital users in about 700 million population. So you can see Malaysia with its AI City Technology Park, Cyberjaya, Putrajaya, and you can see this map again emphasized in Nikita's presentation, why Malaysia focus a lot on digital economy and focus on technology, high-tech industry, because we look at ourselves in terms of moving in that direction in order to become a high-income nation. This is among my last slides, and you can see there are more than 100 regional services hub already in Greater Kuala Lumpur, 103 MNCs from all over the world that has based themselves in Kuala Lumpur. And it's not surprising actually when you look at many of these companies, they find it is easy to work in Malaysia, to make their base in Malaysia. There's so many government agencies, a very supportive industry, a very active Ministry of International Trade and Industry that talk to them, understand them, and facilitate them in terms of doing business in Malaysia. Now, finally, I have basically covered all the things that I wanted to say. It complements exactly what Mr. Nikita has said. In fact, Mr. Nikita has gone a bit more detailed than what I've shown. But remember that the E&E sector, high technology sector, high growth sector is a growth area. The oil and gas energy sector is another sector. I didn't mention aerospace, medical devices, medical tourism, biodiversity. We are rich in biodiversity, so biomedical is very big in Malaysia. A digital free trade zone is what we are moving towards in terms of making digital trade easier. The furniture industry is a growing industry in Malaysia. So there are a lot of opportunities, to continue and talk about. But I will end my talk here, and I welcome any questions. Thank you.